Got it.
Some answers are rolling in. That's great.
And Robin, when you say other, please write in chat. You're saying put it in the chat here on our session.
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
I don't have a way to, I don't think the app will let you do it, but
okay.
Yeah, if you have some questions you're hoping, like maybe a term you've heard that you're wondering about. My goal is to make this interactive. I know that you guys, someone had, a couple of you had seen the presentation I did a couple weeks ago, and I can do the exact same one, but it's also just helpful to know what you're really interested in because, we can tailor it and make it, personalized. And I have two screens, so I get to see those of you with your cameras on my other screen. When you see me looking to the right, it's because I'm looking at you.
All right, so if it's okay, Robin, we will go ahead. And you can leave that screen up there while I just do a little intro comment here. But my name is Trish Warner, and I'm with the Housing Task Force. I'm a member of the Larimer County League up in Loveland, Fort Collins area. So I want to welcome everyone to the League of Women Voters Colorado Housing Task Force meeting tonight. We're here tonight to learn more about one of the pieces, or maybe more of the pieces, of the housing puzzle. Our goal is to advocate for policies that align with the League housing position. So on that note, I'm going to turn things over to Kathy Smith, who is one of our Legislative Action Committee members, and she will be introducing our speaker this evening. While she's getting ready to do that, I would ask that everyone mute themselves so that we don't have any background noise interfering. Or Robin, I'll let you say if it's interactive, maybe you want audio left on for that. So I'll let Kathy go ahead and make the intro.
Thanks, Trish. And I'm with the Jefferson County League. It's my pleasure to be able to introduce our speaker tonight, Robin Kniech. Robin is a former Denver City Councilwoman and Bell Policy Center Economic Mobility Fellow. She recently joined the University of Colorado, Denver as director of the Center for New Directions in Politics and Policy, which is a graduate program for local government and community leaders. Robin served 3 terms as an at-large Denver City Council member and was the first LGBTQ member elected to that body. In that role, she expanded access to and funding for affordable housing, spurred innovations in resolving homelessness, and passed policies on economic mobility like the minimum wage. She was also a leader in moving the city towards more equitable land use and zoning, which was a focus of her Bell Policy Fellowship. Robin has a law degree, and she's also a mom. Welcome, Robin. Take it away.
Hi, everybody. It's really great to be here with you. And thank you for the invite. So I always like to start with a little bit of these surveys because I think it's fun. So I think we will be able to touch on the various topics that you guys mentioned. And I know that this is a statewide meeting, so we will be using Denver only as a case study, actually, not to not because you live here and you need to know all the details, but what can other communities learn from our, things we did right and things we made mistakes on, perhaps. I have one more little exercise for you now. And this one is, if you will take out your phones, if you just joined, go to the same site, Mentimeter or menti.com, menti.com, or use the QR code, and then answer this question about what's the cause of Colorado's housing crisis, and you can answer with multiple things. So go ahead and just start generating some of those if you have a second, because I think it's always helpful to hear the perspectives that you all bring to the meeting before I start diving in. So see if that's working for you. And it doesn't have to be that you believe there's one cause. You might think there's three. So what are the top three biggest? What's a contributor? Why do we have a housing crisis? You guys have probably talked about this a lot in forming your platform that I saw on your website. Okay. Couple responses coming in. All right, we've got the whole gamut here. Perfect. Oh my gosh, you guys are really good at this. All right. So we're going to talk about most of the things on this slide that you guys came up with. So that's really great. So, oh yeah, commodification. Got a couple of these are all about supply, low housing stock, right? Lack of supply showing up here. But we also have these other things, corporate greed, landlord rent collusion, right? We've got a little bit of both on this screen. So I want to share with you my image of what a comprehensive housing strategy looks like. And I actually just forgot to say that I like it to be interactive. And so I will just say, if I use a term, it's hard for me to watch the chat while I'm presenting, but I'll try. But if Kathy is our or Trish, if you guys see that someone has a hand up to clarify a question about a word I'm using or something on a slide, let's stop and do that question, right? There's no need to wait till the end. This is not school. And even school should be interactive, right? So let's do that. But this is my image of what the components of a comprehensive strategy look like. And you see that supply is an important box, and we're going to talk a lot about it today, but it's not the only strategy, right? You have to build dedicated affordable housing. That's usually about money. You have to expand access to existing homes, and that could be affordable homes or market rate. You have to get rid of barriers, right? Racism and discrimination is a barrier, not having accessible housing for people with disabilities, right? You want to get that access. It's not always about building a new home. It might be about getting into one or promoting stability to stay in a home. That's the cheapest housing strategy, is to keep people in a home rather than needing to build a new one. At least if it's the right home for them, right? We talk sometimes about seniors and our older adults who are maybe in really large homes they don't need anymore, but it's actually cost prohibitive. It's too expensive for them to move to something smaller, right? So that's an example where maybe we do want to promote some movement. And then underneath this all is our strategies to shelter and rehouse people who are without homes. So that's, our goal is to get people into one of these boxes of housing strategy. So surely this is how all cities start going about it, right? If this is the best practice, we know that's how government works. We always follow the best practices. Well, maybe not. I gotta get my slides. So this is how the city of Denver started in 2011 when I was elected. Okay, I was elected this year. Denver had 0 local housing funding. We had no Department of Housing or Homelessness. We did not own any shelters, and we had one housing policy, and it required affordability only on for sale housing. And that is because the state of Colorado preempted or prohibited local governments from requiring affordability in rental housing. And so, and that was through a court decision. So this is the desert landscape, right, that we started with in housing policy. Our view was that really affordable housing was an issue only for the people who were poorest of the poor. So we used federal money, maybe a little bit of state money from time to time. And that is how we funded our housing. And we, just played around the edges. We did not have a comprehensive strategy, but the signs of change were coming. So we started to have a crisis of increasing homelessness. This came as the city was becoming, many cities in the Colorado, right? We're coming back from the recession. You remember the Great Recession of 08 to 010 or to 10. And so you started to see Colorado getting on the map. And in Denver, one of the responses to that was to crack down on homelessness. I was on the side that did not support the ban, but it passed. And out of interesting policy debates, sometimes can come new opportunities. So we had a new law in the books that prohibited homelessness, but we had now a mayor and people who voted for it who had to show that they were creating an alternative other than just arresting people. And so I actually got together with people from the other side, the mayor and the lead council sponsor. And we actually together, even though we came from different sides of this issue, began working on the first box of our strategy, which was to build and preserve more dedicated affordable housing, especially for for people who were experiencing homelessness, who had very low incomes. And so we started with, a trajectory that included really putting in money for property tax rebates. We grew that a little bit. We made some updates to our inclusionary housing ordinance, which is the one that required developers to include a little bit of affordability only on for sale, but we wanted it to work better. And then we started to have conversations about funding. Now, in 2016, we were rated the #1 best city in America. This is now a list that Fort Collins is on. So where's my Fort Collins person? You can wave, you know a little bit about that, right? Boulder's been on this list at times. That just increased demand for housing, made it really, brought us on the map. So that is just a little bit what's happening in this time. So things are starting to transform. And so we, with the different sides of that debate, started with one-time money. We got $3 million, planted a little seed, but it was a one-time, just annual budget. Then we did it again. Then we got 8 million. And then we said, this is so late. We need a permanent funding source. So we got together a diverse coalition and we launched a first ever, the largest in the state at the time, housing fund. So $15 million a year. At this time, the state of Colorado's line item on housing, anyone want to put up your fingers and guess how big the state of Colorado's line item was for housing? I'm giving you a hint. You can do it with your hands. Any guesses? It was $8 million. So Denver created a $15 million fund at the time that the state of Colorado's dollars was 8 million. So it was twice the size of the state line item. And then what we did is so you can see it took us, 3 years to get to 14 million. And then we were 85 million in the next 5 years. Okay. So that in all those years, it got us to $99 million, right? In, let's see, 5, 6, 7, 8 years, 8 years to do 99 million. This year, so here's some of the things that did. Right? It helped house or serve 57,000 people. We followed it up with a sales tax for affordable housing for homelessness resolution. The sales tax was for homelessness resolution. That included a part for housing. That together, those two sources are going to create $1 billion by 2030 or so. And so, but we made a bunch of policy changes. I'm not going to go through all this, but you see, we had 1 or 2 things a year. And then it started to get faster. We started to pass more policies. This is just a list of all the policies we passed. If you have questions, let me know, but I know I'm going fast because I want to get to the statewide land use stuff. But the idea here is we built on each step we took, right? And we started each of these different policies actually addressed a different piece of that comprehensive housing strategy I showed you. And in the end, in 10 years, we created 9,000 affordable homes, right? So clearly we solved the problem, right? That's a lot of housing. $1 billion by 2030, 9,000 homes. This is a little bit about our homelessness strategy. I'm not going to if you have questions about homelessness strategy, let me know. But that resulted in 15,000 people getting rehoused out of homelessness. So we're doing both things. We're doing affordable housing. We're doing that rehousing piece you saw. But why didn't it get better? Why do we still have a housing crisis in Denver? Well, this is our median rent, okay? And you can see on the left is 2010, all the way on the right is 2024. Let me show you when we did the things that we did. 2017 is when we launched the Affordable Housing Fund. What's already happening to rent when we launch our housing fund? It's already going up, right? It's already going up. When did we finally get permission to require affordability in rental housing? It got legalized in 2021 and we passed our ordinance in 2022. Every apartment built from 2010 to 2022, we could not require any affordability. It was against the law. So when you ask yourself, did the housing strategies Denver did work? Did they work? And I will say to you that they worked for the people that they served. They worked for 57,000 households who got temporary rental assistance, who got a down payment assistance. They worked for the 9,000 households who got housed. But those numbers, those dollars were not to scale to meet this rent increase that you're looking at on your screen. And I could do this same slide for the state of Colorado, right? It's not a different story. For most communities that are on the Front Range and resort communities, this would look the same. So here's what happens with homelessness over that time, right? It looks a lot like, just look at the rents and then look at homelessness. They're not too dissimilar, right? And especially look at the dark orange. The dark orange is people who are on the streets, not in shelter. You see only the tip of the iceberg when you come through public homelessness in most of our communities. The rest of the iceberg is underwater and shelter. So you need all these components, right? But you also have to do them to scale, and you have to do them in a timely fashion. Denver was late. That's the moral of the story. Not that and I will just say, I'll give you a great example. 82% of people who get supportive housing out of homelessness stay housed. Not for 1 year, not for 2 years, but for 3 years. That is very effective. But we're bringing on a few hundred homes each year, and we have now almost 10,000 people experiencing homelessness in the metro area, right? That's the disconnect. Scale. The method works, the scale does not. So that's your first takeaway for those of you who like takeaways. I'm at the University of Colorado, Denver. If you need a master's degree or you want to get a certificate, come talk to me, but I'm learning objectives. We have to identify our learning objectives. One of yours is scale. Here's the second one. And this one I'm using homelessness to illustrate. Musical chairs. Raise your hand if you ever played this or your kids played it, if you're parents. Musical chairs, right? Okay. So if you have the exact same number of chairs as you do players, what happens? When the music stops, everyone gets a chair, right? Think of the chairs as housing units. If you have enough chairs, everyone gets a chair. But when you start to be short housing units, let's take out 4 chairs and we've got 10 players, right? That's not how it works. It's always one more, but just play with me, right? What happens when the music stops? How do folks try to get to the chair? Think about your kids or yourself when you played this game. You run, you elbow a little, right? You shove, 2 butts go on the chair and the stronger butt pushes the other butt off the chair. The strongest get the chairs, the fastest get the chairs. Imagine people who are single moms. Imagine people who are disabled. Imagine people who are with the lowest incomes. Those are the folks that aren't getting chairs. So we have 2 issues here. We have a systemic issue. The systemic issue is we don't have enough chairs. And then we have a personal issue. The personal issue is that we have someone who's slower or lower income or disabled, right? It's a collision of the 2 that's causing homelessness. And this is really important because poverty does not determine this alone. If it did, we'd have the highest rates of homelessness in the South, but we don't. We do not have the highest rates of homelessness where we have the highest rates of poverty. We have the highest rates of homelessness where we have the most expensive housing and where we have shortages. So this is where we're going to switch to the supply conversation. And I know someone mentioned in here up above Trickle down housing doesn't work. What mechanism could we use to demand guarantee mandatory? I'm going to address this question that was in the chat, right? This is going to be where we go. So true or false? Will housing development help? I want you all to play at home. Pretend you have a button. True or false? Housing development will help. Raise your hand if you think that's true. Okay. All right. I want you to know there are facts to support this. Raise your hand if you think new housing development hasn't helped. We've had a lot of development and it hasn't helped. Raise your hand if you think that's true. Okay. Some of the same people are raising your hands for both. That is true. There is evidence of both. There's evidence of both. The issue is, one, new housing development has been concentrated in certain communities and not everywhere, right? So that's one issue. And even though there has been growth, we still have not caught up to the shortage we had in the past. That's the issue. But it's true that just building doesn't guarantee affordability, at least not at all incomes. It will, the more you get to the tipping point of where you're matching demand, it will help. And we're going to talk about why and how. So how do Coloradans feel about this? They feel just like you do. They actually support building accessory dwelling units. We're going to use the term ADUs, accessory dwelling units, the little house behind the house, right? The little mother-in-law above the garage, casitas. They support more density near transit. They also believe there's been too much development. Kind of funny, huh? That they believe both. And then they also support these other strategies like rent stabilization or limiting rent increases and inclusionary housing. They support supply and they support what I'm going to call going forward equity standards, things that actually ensure or maintain affordability. All right, so let's look at the need in the state. I don't like to do a lot of numbers, but here's the things you need to take away from this slide. We have the most cost burden, all right? And the blue, you're going to look at the bottom. 88% of all renters below 30% of median income. Think about that as about $30,000. 80% of those folks pay half of their income for housing, okay? They're getting crushed. There is a little housing burden, though, up above. If you look above at 51 to 80 and 81 to 100, this is what's new about Colorado's housing crisis, and this is why we know that supply is a factor. These are families that used to be served by the market, and they aren't anymore because wealthy families are living in housing that in the past would have been less expensive. They could have afforded something more expensive, but it wasn't available. So they're renting down, they're buying down. So think about the working class areas of your city. There's probably a neighborhood in Fort Collins or a neighborhood in Denver or a neighborhood in Aurora where you can imagine people are buying less expensive homes and they're putting a ton of money in them. They could have bought a more expensive home. It just wasn't available. Same with income. So we have a shortage of units. We are short about 65% of the units we need in red. This is, we are short a majority of units for those at that below 30%. We have about the number of rental apartments we need for people from 80 to 100. This is really important, and I want you to remember this, okay? Is that we have about the number statewide that we need. It doesn't mean they're in every neighborhood. It doesn't mean they have the right number of bedrooms, and it doesn't mean they're in every town, right? You do not have these many units in Aspen or in Telluride for this income level, but statewide, that's what this means. All right, so what did I do with this research? I looked at the question of whether or not, or why, or how the supply and zoning and all the things that the governor's plans talked about that passed the legislature last year, how they really work. And then whether or not we could reach more households if we paired those things with what I called equity policies, right? And so my theory was that if groups like yours groups like neighborhood groups understood. So one of the questions someone put in the chat is, what do we do with NIMBY? Well, in part, think about how many conversations you've had where anyone has ever explained to you or talked with you at a level you could understand why building expensive homes would help people of moderate incomes. Right? They just told you if you build it, it will get better. That's what they told you. And that's what the governor said in all his speeches, but nobody broke it down. So my theory, and I want you guys to give me feedback on this at the end, is that if we talked more about how it worked and who it really helped, it might actually cut through some of the opposition. So in 23, the legislature did a big comprehensive thing, didn't pair it with any equity at all. They wanted to do land use zoning statewide in every community, and it went down in flames. Then in 2024, they broke it up in pieces. And a lot of people will tell you this is why all these bills passed. But it's only one piece, I think, of why they passed. The other reason I think they passed is they were paired with more equity standards. And I'm going to show you those now. So in 2023, the governor wouldn't support any limits on eviction. He wouldn't support rent stabilization. In 2024, and there was very limited money to go with all the things they did, like more ADUs and more density near transit. There was very little money to make those things truly affordable. In 2024, they came back with bills that the governor signed, like for-cause eviction. They expanded the affordable housing tax credits, including around transit, right where they put that density. They also said, let's add more affordability. That's going to be for folks that are really in those lower incomes that we saw in that earlier slide, who have the greatest need. We improved eviction approaches. We improved all kinds of protections for renters. We did both things, land use and equity. And I believe this is a big piece of why these bills passed the legislature, and they're good policy. So who do they help? Accessory dwelling units on their own, just market rate, no subsidies. Who do they help? Well, they help mostly single adults. We like to talk about them for older adults. And there is a little truth to that, but mostly older adults are homeowners and they don't like giving up homeownership to rent. So it's like below 20% of the occupants are likely to be older adults, but an important option for them. And then they're going to be at these incomes that I showed in those previous bars. These are folks who are just starting to struggle a little bit with rental housing, but some of them actually would maybe be candidates for ownership. But maybe they don't have the credit or they don't want to own. But these are our higher income renters, but they have had in some communities shortages. And they definitely do not live in all the same neighborhoods that these ADUs are built. So if you think about your cities and towns, apartments are in one area, single family homes are in another. Maybe the best schools are where the single family homes are. But building the ADU is going to give that individual, or if they have any kids, not a lot of them are going to have kids because they're mostly 0 and 1 bedroom, but it's going to put them near other amenities. How about transit near density? Who does that help? Well, certainly the first people it helps is high earning renters. They're going to build luxury. It's going to happen, but hang with me, hang in with me. Then you have folks there's research that shows immediate buildings right near new buildings, and not zoned, but new buildings. The buildings go down by $100 and $150 in rent. That is an immediate benefit, makes those rents a little bit better. And that is not the same as trickle down citywide, but it is a little bit of immediate market impact. And then you have buyers. So every time we build condos and townhomes, the average price, not everyone, I'll point to an expensive townhome for $800,000. I'm sure you can too. But on average, condos and townhomes are less than the equivalent single family new home today. So you can't compare an old single family home and a brand new condo, right? But if you're looking at resale, right, that's where the median, the average, you are going to get more affordable home ownership opportunities on average with townhomes and condos than you will with single family homes. That brings more people into home ownership who have market rate incomes. All right. So, but who's helped if you add policy and subsidy? Well, You can help ADUs if you give a down payment loan and you say, listen, I'll give you a $50,000 loan to build your ADU, but you have to agree to rent it to a family with 80% or 60% of median income, right? A little bit lower income family. I'm going to give you a $75,000 loan if you build a 2 or 3 bedroom that will be for kids, right? Because you're going to need more money because it's going to be a bigger unit. It's going to be more expensive to build. So with money, with subsidies, you can get to lower people. And I'm going to, we don't have too much more to go through before we get to the interactive part. So you guys are being very attentive. And I want you to know I'm not just going to talk at you the whole time. So what about density near transit? If you add tax credits to those new apartments or new condos, you get to much lower incomes. And then if you do down payment assistance or you are using your subsidies to build affordable homes, you're going to get more affordable homes building condos than you would have gotten using those subsidies to build for sale. So these are the folks that you can help with subsidy. I want to take on the question about trickle down. So the old theory was that if you build a lot of housing, everything becomes cheaper. And that was trickle down. That happens, but it happens over 20, 40-year horizons. It takes a long time for the older units to get older and to get cheaper. Or it takes massive quantities of housing, which most communities can't even build, even if they're zoned for it, because the market and land and all the things. But we do have really good evidence. So let's build a brand new, on our left, up in the top left corner, let's build a brand new luxury apartments building. It's going to be expensive. And who's going to move into it is high-income households. But some of those households were in slightly less expensive apartments, right? They just were waiting for enough housing to get built and they want to be in this other place and now they're there. So they vacate housing. 20% of the homes they vacate are going to be in less expensive areas. 20% in that first couple moves. So who moves into those homes? Well, folks who come from slightly lower income areas and on down the chain. By the time you get through the 6th move, 40% of the units or the homes that are opening up are in lower income areas. Okay. Now in Europe, where they actually have much more data about people's incomes by household than we do, we kind of keep some of that anonymized in the US. They don't in Europe. They can actually tell you that not just are these people moving from lower income units, they're actually lower income families. So it's not trickle down price change. It's that new housing opens up vacancies and reduces competition for other units. That's how it helps more moderate income folks. Okay. It's not a silver bullet. It doesn't happen. This is within 2 years, by the way. This entire slide reflects about 2 years of moves, right? Is how fast it occurs. So it happens faster than that trickle down thing I mentioned to you. All right. So how much can we expect? Well, we might see if ADUs take off and all the cities implement it and there's financing and the interest rates come down and the economy doesn't crash, once we got to the same level of permitting that California did, we could maybe see 3,500 ADUs a year. The law doesn't cover the whole state. It only covers the Front Range and a couple cities in the Western Slope, like Grand Junction. Density near transit covers even fewer cities, only 31 cities. And we don't really know exactly how much that's going to create, but it's going to take a long time. You don't need to memorize the side. Just take from this the years. It's going to take a while for this new housing to show up. Because first the cities have to change the law. Then people have to pull permits. Then they have to finance the construction. This is a multi-year project, okay? So what about those equity policies I mentioned? Why are they so important? They're not just important because they help us get to lower incomes. Some of those renter protections are really important because they go into effect right away. They create protections right away. Now, Colorado still prohibits use of rent caps or rent control, But other states that have done big land use reform, I mentioned California already, Oregon has as well, they also cap rents. Here's a big takeaway. Rent control does not lower the cost of housing. Got to absorb this. Rent control does not lower the cost of housing. All that it does is it slows the increase in prices over time. That's all it does. It slows the increase. You can rent the original unit at whatever price you want. It just limits how much you can increase that over time. But it is a protection, right? Go back to that slide I showed with rents. It would make that a little, little different. So it matters. It matters because the majority of housing stock is older. So this is the story. I know that you've already started some questions. I'm going to stop the share so I can see you. This is, I have a newsletter. It's called it's on a platform called Substack. You can subscribe for free. I think some of you might already be on it, but if you're not and you want to read the stuff I put out, some of you said you were interested in inclusionary housing, and I can talk some more about that. But I wanted to see where the questions were first. But I will leave this up for a second, and then we can start to look at, let's see. I have a question about a glut of construction, rents at 2,000. When will builders cave and turn properties over to the city, house low-income people and not rented apartments? Well, there's a couple of reasons why we don't see rents going down even when vacancy goes up. Folks like to keep their rents at the highest rate possible. And so what they're more likely to do is to give 2 months of rent away free and get you hooked on the high rent, right? And then keep you at that high rent because they're worried that if they turn over some units at lower rents, then they have a hard time with the people who did pay the high rent. So it's hard. The second reason they don't necessarily have a huge incentive is, let's say that they spent $10 million to build the building and they expected to get $1 million in rent back each year. I'm making these numbers up, you guys, but I'm just for sake of argument. So that I'm going to go ahead and stop the share so we can all see each other. So in that case, let's say they only make $800,000 a year and they don't have enough to pay off all their bills. They have a loss. What do we do with losses in the United States? Each year on April 15th, what do we do with our losses? Do you pay taxes on your losses? What do you take? You take it off your income. You reduce your income and you get a tax benefit. And so if you have vacant units, it does hurt you. I want to make clear, they're not like living large off of, losses, but they do have some incentives built into the tax system. Let's see. I have a question here about the status of construction defects law. So this is a complicated one. Remember our true false where both could be true? So right now, condos are sitting on the market for an average of 60 days, and they're selling with concessions. They're not flying off the shelves like hotcakes. Why aren't they? Well, because interest rates are high, because buyers don't have enough money. Some developers have actually turned their condo projects into apartments because they did not have enough prospect of selling them. So construction defects is not the only thing determining how many condos get built. The market determines a lot of these things, and we're not always honest about the full market picture. But it is also true that insurance costs drive up condo construction, and that is a concern for builders, and they're very cost adverse. I think the question of would they build $200,000 condos if the law was changed, I don't know. As long as they're selling $500,000 condos, they're going to keep building $500,000 condos, right? That's the law of supply and demand. I will sell my product at the highest price it can get. So I don't know that we can say that with construction defects reform, and just so folks know what that is, that means how easy or hard it is to sue someone for a defect if you're in a condo building, right? That's kind of what it means. The law is a little different for single family homes because it's only one person, but a condo, 20 units, 50 units. So I want to open it up now and see what other questions or responses you guys have. Like, how'd this land? What do you think? But I'm going to open it up and I can see either if you want to use the react button, you can raise hand there, or you can just raise it physically if your camera's on, but I'm going to drink water while you ponder your questions or thoughts.
That was a lot of information, Robin.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Was it too fast?
No, but I will ask if you're able to send your PowerPoint presentation to me so that we can share it for further digesting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, great.
I think in part, I wanted the focus to be more on the story than the details, right? I think,
Yes.
because I really think that we don't all have to be housing experts to kind of understand why this is hard, or why sometimes things that, you know, seem like they couldn't possibly both be true are, you know, like, I think it's more about the concepts, but I totally appreciate, and I can go back over anything. I always just want to make sure there's time for discussion, but I can also take that feedback and do less.
Perfect.
I
No,
see a
thank
question,
you.
Kathy Smith.
Yep, Kathy.
Thank you, Robin. That was great.
Mhm.
So there was a question in the chat I wanted to point out about cheaper methods of building, such as modular and 3D printed homes. So I wanted to point that out and get your comments, and then was hoping that you get more into a discussion of the role of NIMBY and
Yep.
how groups like ours can address that.
Yes, thank you so much. So, you know, I think that there are definitely some builders doing, so there's a single family home builder out in Green Valley Ranch area, Gateway, in near the, on your way to the airport, who is doing modular building of single family homes. They kind of are like townhome row homes, shaped and sized, but they have their own walls. They get built in a factory, and they are, they say, delivering them at a lower price than they are, you know, the original build. You have to have a plant really nearby to do that. You have to account for construction costs, or I'm sorry, transportation costs. So you have different kinds of costs that you incur. For apartments and multifamily buildings, it's been a little trickier. My wife does consulting with people building supportive housing for those leaving homelessness. And you guys, some of you may have heard of Indie Dwell, which was like a, you know, container, you know, modular builder out down in Pueblo. I don't know if we have anyone from the South Front Range here, but you know, they were 5 years delayed, right? And they don't really understand building codes, and like, yeah, I make this product, but what if the building code in the city is different? And so there are challenges. Some of the earlier products were designed in California. They don't do great in our weather, you know? So there's a lot of, I think it's being explored. Some of the state stuff that's happening on this is uniform building codes that can help so that they don't have that different building code in each city problem, but you of course have pushback for local control. NIMBY is one issue. What is the balance between local control and state control is a really big theme in this area, right? And so we can talk more about that. In terms of NIMBY, you know, I think there is a portion of people who experience change as traumatic. They experience change in housing patterns in their neighborhoods as risk for their own home ownership, their own safety. Some of that is perception. Very little of it bears out in data. But none of, I mean, think about your daily life. How often do you think about data? You mostly think about your values, think about your beliefs, you think about where you came from and what you learned from your family of origin. So we have to be thoughtful about, I don't think burying people who struggle with those questions is simply about data. Like, I brought you data today because this is a group of engaged people who wanted to learn, right? But, you know, when you have a project proposed in a neighborhood and you have, you know, 100 neighbors, not all of them are coming to the League of Women Voters meeting, right? To get that engagement. And so I think that a lot of the advice, there's an amazing woman who you can watch her on YouTube. And of course I said that, and the second I did it, you like writing on the right board, the name goes out of your Tiffany Manuel. Tiffany Manuel has a book, and she has some YouTube videos and speeches on this about the idea of how our messaging is not landing with people, right? They think that housing is for someone else. They think maybe, you know, whether those people do or don't deserve it. So a little bit of this is all boats float better, right? Like our whole community is wealthier if there's more townhomes that people can buy, right? Or our whole community is better off if, you know, families can live integrated and be near their loved ones in an accessory dwelling unit. And, you know, versus like the idea of a giveaway or something like that. So some of it is that, but so I think there's a portion of people who are never going to get there. And I think one of the issues is to make sure that other voices have space, right? We never recommend that people do town hall meetings with a microphone as the way to discuss housing, because we don't allow people to say whether their neighbors should be Jewish or not, or gay or not, or Black or not. But somehow we've created a town hall format to really invite whether your neighbors should be, you know, of a slightly different income than you or not. And it's just, you know, so this is where, you know, you're a civic engagement group. You're all about democracy. But should housing be a democratic issue? Should a majority of a community get to decide who lives there? I mean, our country did have that system for a really long time. And the majority decided who could live where based on race and religion and sexual orientation and other things. So I think that like we have to change the types of meetings that we hold. It's always, there are ways that people can get questions answered and information without giving the most space to the loudest, but most, you know, opposed voice, right? And then you have to find a way to speak to those in the confused middle who are like, yeah, like, remember I showed you that slide, 50 to 60 percent of people are like, yes, more density near transit. Yes, more ADUs. That shows us we can work with the majority of our state, but we have to be able to do it in ways that give them space, separate from the vitriol, and that brings them in with their values. We cannot tell them they're wrong. And I will tell you, I love my friends in YIMBY. They've been huge promoters of change, but sometimes it comes off as single family homes suck. And, you know, single family zoning is evil. And that creates a lot of hackles for people versus saying we can add townhomes to single family areas and add wealth and add home ownership opportunities. And it's not about taking away, you know, like, I mean, it's just kind of like framing, but that is, I mean, this is kind of the purpose of my project, right? Is that I want to find new ways of talking about this, where hardcore affordability advocates like myself see that there is a role even for market rate housing, but we got to just bring people along in a different way. So that was a long answer. Sorry, Kathy. What do you think?
Well, that was good, and I agree that we need to come up with different formats. And as an educator, you know, when my son was little, he went to a thing that kind of changed his view of approaching life with the Young American Bank, where they did role playing, and they became it. They kind of played the game of life, and they had decision makers, and they had people with all walks of life, and they got to experience what it was like. And you know, he ended up with a sick wife and 5 kids, and he had to like borrow money from his, you know, Playboy photographer friend that he went to the class with. But he learned a lot from that. So I'm wondering if, as an educator, we could be designing things that we could take to communities that would be kind of like the game of life, where people could role play or something like that and really gain some empathy through participation on things like that.
Yeah, I think the less abstract these concepts are, you know, so my friend from Fort Collins, right? I like to tell the Fort Collins story, which is that for those of you who don't know, they had a package to try to expand housing access and options in Fort Collins. And it was, you know, shot down by threats of taking it to the ballot and the expectation that if they did, they would win. But at the very same time, there's a transit and land use plan that Fort Collins did that had hundreds of meetings and participants. And they asked people, design the kind of neighborhood you'd want to live in and what you'd want it to look like and what you'd want to be. And people designed walkable, medium density neighborhoods with frequent transit. They literally chose that as their most preferred option. The same community. Right. But in that case, there were pictures in front of them and they saw what it looked like to be able to walk from the train station to the grocery store. It wasn't this abstract, we're getting rid of your single family home. Totally different types of conversations. So yes to what you said. I think scenarios and on the ground experiential things, and the challenge is getting those to scale, right? Because the number of people who vote in an election is bigger than the number of people who come to the meeting for that exercise. So that's our challenge, right? Scale. Did y'all get that in your notes? What else?
Robin, you mentioned the permanent supportive housing or the supportive housing piece with the homeless. Could you talk a little bit about how you see the progression of housing for people who are homeless, if it's on the street, permanent supportive housing?
Yep. Can I share an image? Do you
Yeah.
mind? Yeah. So I'm going to share what Denver's continuum looks like right now. It's not how it always looked. Okay. You seeing a slide with like a continuum on it that says 2023 on top?
Yes.
Excellent.
Yes.
Oh, I just clicked it. So the most important thing on this slide is you do not start at the left and work your way to the right step by step. That is extremely rare. This slide represents every single one of these lines is a different entry point for a person who experiences homelessness. And so, you know, over here on the left, not on the chart, is like sleeping on the streets with no shelter at all, right? And this overnight emergency shelter, I'm going to be very honest, for those of you who are not in Denver, this is probably the only thing happening in your community, perhaps only in the winter. Very few of your communities have year-round shelters, and very few of them have a shelter where someone can stay during the day and actually get services. So their life will be saved, maybe, because they're not freezing to death or run over by a car in an alley, but not much more is going to happen. They're not actually going to get referrals or resources to these other things because they're just not there during the day, right? So every step you take to the right on this continuum is a step with more services and more autonomy and more stability. Okay, that's what this represents. And so every single step to the right is better than the step to the left, but not perfect for everyone. So some folks, I'm just going to point out, in a 300-person shelter, which is not uncommon in Denver, where you are literally the COVID 6 feet from the person sleeping next to you, you can smell if they had onions. You can hear their snoring. You know, you may have history with them, disagreements, right? Think about if you had to live 6 feet from your least favorite neighbor who you know and don't want to, you know, see every day. So that's not for everyone. Some people, the only place they can go is the safe outdoor space because the ice shanty tent is private. They can get dressed in privacy. They can decide if they want to read late at night and, you know, sleep, or if they have a job and they need to work hours that don't match the shelter. They have autonomy. So that might be where they start. Here at the right is supportive service, housing with supportive services, right? And what you have is in Denver, you combined our city funds that I shared with state vouchers that came from some marijuana dollars, and you have money for the construction, money for the services, and money for the rent subsidy. People still pay 30% of their income in rent. This is one of the things Tiffany Manuel, she thinks that when people hear affordable housing, they think people who aren't paying any rent. So we need to talk more about the fact that everyone will pay a third of their income for rent. And lots of people who are experiencing homelessness have income. They might have veteran benefits, they might have disability benefits, they might have contingent work, variety of things. Not all of them and not on day one maybe, but it's there. So hopefully that gives you a little bit of picture, but ask me follow-up questions if you have them about supportive housing.
So who funds supportive housing?
Yeah, so the construction is funded by some federal tax credits and then some grants from cities and the state. So we call that gap money. It's the smallest part. The biggest part is those federal tax credits. That's for most new construction. Some of the motels that you see being converted to housing might have been bought with ARPA money from the federal government's one-time COVID relief funds. And then the service dollars are usually from maybe Medicaid, right? If you think about it, when you have a mental health disorder, it's a health disorder, right? And if you are eligible for Medicaid, the person giving you that service can bill for it. Because, in theory, if you're treated, you're going to need less hospitalization, which is really expensive. So it's cheaper to give you a mental health clinician in your building than it is to wait for you to have a mental breakdown, right? And be in a hospital. So you can also see funding in Denver. We have local funding for supportive services. I don't think many of your other communities have that. Mountain communities, some of them have some dedicated funds, but we're just, we're a little bit bigger and had a little more urgent need, but other communities might provide one-time funds for services, but probably don't have an ongoing source. And then that rental voucher can be one of two things. It could be what you used to hear about the Section 8 voucher. We don't call them that anymore. We call them housing choice vouchers from your housing authority. That's something that almost every Front Range county is covered by a housing authority, and they have some of those vouchers. Denver has its own voucher. The Veterans Administration has some vouchers. So that will cover the rent. And then that other remaining part is from the person's income, like we talked about. So that's it's probably the most complicated spaghetti you can imagine to fund this housing. It's not easy, which is why it takes 3 to 5 years to do it. And why our pace is kind of slow. It is partially about money. It's partially about the timeline of how difficult it is to put the money together. And then a little bit about Kathy's thing about community pushback makes it harder too.
Yeah, thank you. How about others? Any questions?
I got a couple things in the chat.
Okay, let me catch up.
Oh, there you go.
During the Depression, the Roosevelts had people out of work. Yeah, that was our last big federal housing boom. There were two. There was and I'll be honest, it was really to provide workforce housing for the military. So if anyone has not read The Color of Law, it's a fabulous history. But that housing might have been people who were out of work at the time, but it was built and funded only because they wanted them to then work in the war industries and in naval bases and things like that. So most of the communities were that type of, and they, were not obviously very durable, all of them. So some of them got torn down because once the war was over, communities wanted to move, especially workers of color, out further from their cities. So they actually tore some of that housing down, even maybe before they had to. The next big boom for housing was post-World War II, right? With the returning veterans and the beginning of suburbs and the funding of the highway system and all of that. And so basically, I would say that, we have zoned ourselves into such uniformity and such, this is where people talk about exclusionary zoning, the idea that the standards become so high that even if there was funding for this, most community zoning codes wouldn't allow it, right? And so how bad will it have to get, right, before the federal government? We did have a presidential candidate who talked about a plan for housing. She was not elected. The current president has not identified a specific plan, so we'll have to see. He did talk about wanting to get rid of regulation. We just don't know which regulations. He's mostly talked about wanting to build on federal lands. So not so much in communities that exist. So that's, some of us would call that sprawl or, further from transportation, further from jobs, further from schools. So it may create housing units, but it might be more of the drive to qualify. And then there's environmental standards. So it's not clear which regulations he wants to relax. Other question here. It's ugly. High density is too much traffic. How do we answer those? Well, I think design standards are part of it sometimes, which people, our governor would say design standards, and our current president-elect would say that design standards are part of the regulations that are making it too expensive, but I also think they help communities accept new housing if they do feel like at least it's going to match the character. So I think there's a trade-off. Same thing with affordability standards, right? They'll say that's killing it because it's too expensive to build 10 affordable units in a 100-unit building. But I say, well, then maybe you shouldn't build it at all, because once you build it as luxury, it's gone forever. So at least 10 units I'll have, for 99 years. So I don't think there's easy answers because it's not that people don't really believe these things, but they're also the language behind, I don't want the change, right? The underlying value, the underlying fear is the change and the concerns, right? My favorite example on traffic is Lowry. There used to be a military base with thousands of workers a day in Lowry. And now people say that any new development near Lowry is creating too much traffic. It's like thousands of cars less than it was when it was a military base. But like telling people they're wrong is rarely going to help change anybody's mind. It certainly hasn't helped me in my life when I've been told I'm wrong. It doesn't, So I don't have easy answers. Anyone else ever had anything successful with a direct response to those things? Sometimes you have to push through opposition,
Yeah.
I
one of
live
the
in Golden, and 95% of the workers don't live in Golden. So my argument is that all the extra traffic is actually due to the people who can't live here or don't live here.
Yeah.
And if they lived here, there'd be less traffic. But people don't want to hear that.
Yeah, you all have wisdom. You've all lived this. And were you going to add something too, Trish?
Well, I was just going to say I was part of a meeting today where a lot of the discussion was around the political will to actually do some of these things, and the example was given that when you have say a project that's coming to the Planning and Zoning Commission and you've got 100 people that are opposed to that and maybe 10 people there to speak in favor of it, and all those voices in that room, if there's not the will to follow through on the mission, which is to provide more housing, more affordable housing, they hear all the negatives about the project, and it gets voted down. So
Yeah,
the political will is an issue.
Yeah, and I think it's really interesting. I mean, this is why I think we have to talk about democracy, right? Because I brought up a minute ago, our vision of democracy is majority rules. That's what's just. And I think, we have to really have a very articulate reason for saying democracy needs to work differently where people's basic human needs are happening. Right. And that the democracy is that I have the right to learn about it, that I have the right to, get my questions answered, but not that I have the right to stop it. And that's really, as an out lesbian, I often talk about, the idea that if I had to wait for majority rule, for a vote for any of my rights, right? There would be no LGBTQ rights in a lot of places, but because some folks have stood up and said, you actually shouldn't put people's ability to marry or get healthcare on a ballot, we're going to, make the law anyway. And so, but they needed enough political support, enough political movement. So it's like I think the story of LGBTQ rights is a very illustrative one of like, you still had some opposition as rights were being granted by political leaders, most of whom are straight, just like most of our political leaders don't need affordable housing, but they have to identify. And so I do think, the question of do you know your local electeds? Do they know they can call on you to come to those meetings? You know, are you able to find 5 others? Are you able to give them letters? If people don't want to go to mob meetings, that's what I call them, mob meetings, but could they write a letter that could be read on the record, right? You know, or could they support their elected in some other way to get those quiet voices heard? But ultimately, you're right. It is, and this is why the state acted. You know, a lot of local governments are not happy that the state required some of these things.
Right.
You know, I was a council member, but I also see how hard it is to speak up against those types of vocal minority group, you know, not minority people, but numbers, right? And so, so I think, you know, that's why the state acted to say we're going to cut out that factor. No more mob meeting about accessory dwelling units. You're just going to do them.
Right. Yeah.
So the question about, but I do think there's a tipping point, and I don't think you can get like the LGBTQ rights movement, you can't get that far ahead, right? Of where people are. You have to bring people with you. By the time the Supreme Court did the marriage decision, a majority of Americans supported marriage because the work had been done to tell stories about what it was like to be locked out of a hospital room when your spouse, you know, your loved one was dying, or, you know, raising kids without the ability to, you know, protect them legally with your parental rights. And, you know, I think that like the fear I have is, yeah, you know, the state took political action and they took it out of the hands of the local official who's getting beat up. But I just don't know at a certain point, do you get a retaliatory ballot measure like Golden's growth limits or Lakewood's growth limits, and then that gets that statewide? Do you know where, if you don't bring people with, because it's hard for, I can't blame it all on local electeds when we have not given them the tools, the community. I mean, most of your electeds are part-time. They don't even get paid anything. How are they going to do this messaging work we've talked about? It's not realistic, right? So we also, I'm not going to throw local electeds under the bus, which I think this conversation does a lot. And it says these people just don't have the political will and they suck. And I think that is an incomplete analysis.
Right.
Yeah. Any other
Okay.
questions
Other
before we wrap?
question, comments? That was
Yeah.
a great conversation, Robin. We really do appreciate all that information. And
Thanks.
I did
I'm gonna-
sign up for your Substack account.
All right. I'm
Yes.
glad. I'm glad. It's, you know, I talk a little bit about Denver, but a lot about Colorado. So just skip the ones that you're not interested in. I'm going to leave my email here. And I'm going to ask if anyone has feedback on parts that, you know, like, hey, this was too confusing. I didn't get it. Slow yourself down, which I know is a thing. I'm trying to maybe do too much. I'm happy to get, or your other thoughts that you want to continue the conversation. I'm trying to remember my email address. Is it a Monday? Robin@robinkniech.net. Okay.
I also want to recommend your Bell Policy research papers.
Yes. Yeah.
Which are
I will
excellent.
try to remember to email Kathy or whomever when the last one comes out on inclusionary housing.
That'd be great. That'd be wonderful.
Yeah, that one is going to be contentious. Just going to share.
And thank you, Kathy, for sending that information out to all the members of the Housing Task Force. Very good information, background.
So before we sign off, can I ask for Andrea and Kate and Trish and Joe, if there she is, to stick around at the end for a
Sure.
quick question. Thank you, Robin. Really
And
appreciate it.
thanks,
Guys,
Robin.
I really appreciate it. Have a great night, everybody.
Yeah, appreciate all you do.
Thanks for your work.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.